Donald Trump dismissing these 50 foreign policy critics as the failed Washington elite. He paints them as irrelevant has-beens out to advance their own careers. Here's more of what Trump said in that Fox Business interview this morning.
I hadn't planned on using any of these people. I guess for the most part, I haven't even spoken to any of these people because I like to speak to a new group. The old group was not doing it. Take a look at the Middle East. Take a look at the problems that we have. And the last people I want to use are the people that have been doing it for the last long period of time. So you know, they don't feel relevant because of that. And they form a group and they go out and they try and get some publicity for themselves. And they hope that somebody else other than Trump wins because that way they can get a job.
Kyron Skinner is a Republican Party strategist, a foreign policy expert. Kyron, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you're someone the Trump campaign suggested we talk to about all of this. I assume you're a Trump supporter. Is that right?
I'm evolving to a Trump supporter. I'm trying to really find a way to craft a foreign policy that is forward-looking out of a number of the statements and speeches that Mr. Trump has given, and I believe that we're evolving in that direction. And I disagree with my good colleague Eric Edelman that we shouldn't relitigate the Iraq War. I do think in the context of a presidential campaign, past is prologue for the future, and we really need to understand what went wrong and the lessons learned. I do think the world is better off with Saddam Hussein. I agree with him there. But I think that there were a number of path-dependent mistakes that we don't want to make again. And I disagree that there's no substance to what Mr. Trump is saying. In fact, he's talked about we can't be nation builders in the Middle East, that we need to help create stability. These are things that many on that list of 50 agree with. He's talked about having a more aggressive policy toward China in the South China Sea. This is something that many on the list of 50 agree with. In fact, many Republicans and Democrats agree with as well. I think the pity of the whole Trump campaign in terms of what the media and others have done is that they haven't really looked at the substance of what he said. I do understand the blistery rhetoric stops many people cold. But in fact, he is articulating a set of ideas that are not just extreme. Many of them are in the center of the conversation. And I'd like to get back to that discussion because I think it's so vital now if we're going to revise American foreign policy.
One of the criticisms in that letter by these 50 Republican national security advisors was this, and let me put it up on the screen, Kyron, for you and for our viewers. Unlike previous presidents who had limited experience in foreign affairs, Mr. Trump has shown no interest in educating himself. He continues to display an alarming ignorance of basic facts of contemporary international politics. Now, Kyron, you're a professor of international relations. You constantly want to educate yourself. What's your response to those national security advisors who served under Republican presidents that he doesn't have an adequate grasp of the international national security issues?
What really bothers me about that conversation, not just from our 50 colleagues who signed that letter, but from many others who are making similar statements, I just wonder if it's possible to run for and become president of the United States and not be part of the foreign policy or economic policy elite and establishment in the U.S. And I believe that Trump's campaign is as much about breaking down the control of existing elites and in effect selecting themselves whom the American public will choose from. So I think there's part of that's going on. But also, I do think that the fact that he has a deeper grasp through what he has said in his big April foreign policy speech, for some reason, just keeps being ignored. He talked about, you know, a much more detailed Muslim policy. He said, and Middle East policy broadly. He talked about a summit with our Muslim allies. He talked about not abandoning NATO. So at first he was talking in those terms, but he's talking about shared European security. And if we're going to have the NATO pledge mean something, where countries who have committed to this idea, war against one is war against all, then all should do more. These are not extremist views. And I'd like to see us be able to unpack his ideas and see where, in fact, he's offering some innovations. That hasn't started yet, and I hope, Wolf, on your program, you will encourage that conversation.
All right, so just to be precise now, Kyron, you're evolving towards supporting Donald Trump, but you're not there yet. Is that right?
No, I would, I use that term, but I think in terms of foreign policy and what I understand that he's attempting to do, I will support him. And I want to see an evolution on issues of race and rights and discussion by the candidate. I think that will broaden his base of support. Reagan, in fact, began to do that in the 1980 campaign. And Wolf, I've done a lot of work on Reagan. If in fact, Mr. Trump can articulate more clearly his issues, his views on this broad range of issues, from race and rights in America to what it means to have America First security and America First economy, knit all of those together, I will be in a very strong supporter of this candidate, because I think we need a broader conversation, and he is the one who, in fact, won the Republican primaries. I don't think we can dismiss that very fact. It would be a mistake.
All right, Kyron Skinner, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.